Good evening and welcome to the audience here in the Iowa City Public Library and to those who are watching the lecture live streaming on the library's YouTube channel. The hero you don't know, Hubert Humphrey and the long struggle for civil rights, is the second program in the Johnson County League of Women Voters 24-25 season. Before I turn the podium over to Sammy DeRegan, who will introduce tonight's speakers, I'd like to recognize the university and community sponsors who have made this program possible and brought all of us together this evening, and this is a wonderful crowd. Glad to see you all here. The idea for tonight's program, for me anyway, arrived as an email from Carolyn Tolbert on April 16th, and she wanted to initiate a conversation about the League hosting a talk by Samuel Freedman and Norman Sherman on Humphrey's role in championing civil rights at the state and federal levels. As it so happened, the League's Education Committee was just beginning to plan this season's lecture series, and as of May 7th, we had a three-way partnership with the Political Science Department and the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. And we also had a date on the events calendar with the Iowa City Public Library, who is our regular co-sponsor, providing this wonderful meeting room and the outstanding staff who live stream our programs and then record them for rebroadcast later. We are very pleased to be joined by many co-sponsors. From the university, they are the Afro-American Cultural Center, better known as Afro House, which has provided an inclusive space on campus since 1968, and Hawkeye History Corps, which promotes the study and appreciation of history for majors and non-majors at Iowa. And tonight, two members of the Hawkeye History Corps, Owen King and Joseph Wojtak, are going to be serving one of them as a mic runner for the Q&A. And Owen, you will see circulating around the room taking photographs during the program. From the community, our co-sponsors are Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, the Iowa City Cedar Rapids Alumni Chapter, Black Voices Project, which works to create a thriving Black culture in Iowa City, Trail of Johnson County, Trail being the acronym, for those of you who don't know, for Tools and Resources for Active Independent Living, and Global Ties Iowa, which creates and supports citizen diplomacy initiatives in the corridor area. We thank all of our co-sponsors for tonight's program, and I want to give a shout out, a special shout out to Norman Sherman, who, in addition to being on the program this evening, devoted his weekly column, which ran Monday in the Gazette, to promoting tonight's event. Thank you very much, Norman. It's a wonderful program. And League of Women Voters, there's information about Black Voices Project, Trail, Delta Sigma Theta at the back, and the League of Women Voters also has information up here. And if you'd like a yard sign on voting, feel free to take one this evening. With that, I'm going to turn the podium over to League Board Member Sammy DeRegan, who will formally introduce our speakers this evening.
Good evening, everyone. Before I get into the formal introductions, I would also just like to thank Rebecca and the rest of the Education Committee from the League of Women Voters for all of their efforts in helping to organize this wonderful program for this evening. Tonight's program commemorates the 60th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and shines a spotlight on one of the key figures who navigated its passage through Congress, Hubert Horatio Humphrey. It is my honor to introduce tonight's speakers. Norman Sherman is a native of Minnesota, and he personally knew many of the figures in Minnesota that Sam Freedman writes about in his latest book, Into the Bright Sunshine. Sherman has called it the best book yet about Hubert Humphrey, and he should know. He enjoyed a long career as an advisor and speechwriter for many of Minnesota's progressive political figures, including Orville Freeman, Eugene McCarthy, Walter Mondale, and tonight's subject. Hubert Humphrey served as mayor of Minneapolis from 1943 to 1948, U.S. Senator from Minnesota from 1949 to 1964, and again from 1970 to 1978, and he was the 38th Vice President of the United States from 1965 to 1969 during Lyndon Johnson's presidential administration. Sherman was part of Vice President Humphrey's inner circle, serving as his press secretary and close aide. Sherman also edited Humphrey's 1976 autobiography, The Education of a Public Man, and for those of you who are students of political history, the background materials for that book are housed in the Minnesota Historical Society. From Nowhere to Somewhere, My Political Journey, published in 2015, is Sherman's own account of national politics in the 1960s. He currently lives in Coralville, and some of you in the audience might read his weekly column in the Cedar Rapids Gazette. Some of you, in fact, might be in this room because of Monday's column on tonight's program. Samuel G. Freedman currently holds the rank of professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He has won many awards for his books and newspaper columns. His 2023 book, Into the Bright Sunshine, is the latest of 10. His previous books include Small Victories, The Real World of a Teacher, Her Students, and Their High School, which was a finalist for the 1990 National Book Award, Upon This Rock, The Miracles of a Black Church, which won the 1993 Helen Bernstein Award for Excellence in Journalism, and The Inheritance, How Three Families in America Moved from Roosevelt to Reagan and Beyond, which was the finalist for the 1997 Pulitzer Prize. Some of you might recognize his name in connection with Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, The Journey from Stage to Screen, and his 2020 companion book to the film adaptation of August Wilson's classic play. In 2021, his book Jew versus Jew won the National Jewish Book Award for nonfiction. From 1981 through 1987, he was a staff reporter for the New York Times, but his association with the Times has a much longer run. From 2004 through 2008, he wrote the papers On Education column, winning first prize in the Education Writers Association's annual competition in 2005. From 2006 to 2016, he wrote the On Religion column, receiving the Goltzier Prize for Journalists in 2017 for a series of columns about Muslim Americans that had been published over the preceding 6 years. Professor Freedman was named the nation's outstanding journalism educator in 1997 by the Society of Professional Journalists, and in 2012, he received Columbia University's coveted Presidential Award for outstanding teaching. Tonight, he opens our program on The Hero You Don't Know, Hubert Humphrey and the Long Struggle for Civil Rights. It echoes the title of his latest book, which, as Sherman reminded us in Monday's newspaper column, harks back to Humphrey's speech at the 1948 Democratic National Convention, when he declared that the time has come to get out of the shadows of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. Please welcome Norman Sherman and Sam Freedman.
Thank you so much, Sammy, and on behalf of both Norman and myself, thank you to all the sponsors. I feel like it was a testament to communitarian spirit and public citizenship to hear all the different groups that are involved in making tonight happen. And I have to say, selfishly, since this book came out in July of 2023, I've done a lot of different book talks in different formats, but there is no event I've looked forward to more than being in public conversation with Norman Sherman, who's one of the treasures of American politics. Yeah. Just deal with it, Norman. And before I give a little introduction with some slides, some illustrations to our talk, I also just want to say how good it is to be here in Iowa City. You may wonder what a guy from Highland Park, New Jersey might have to do with Iowa City, but I actually have a lot of Iowa City cred I want you to know. My uncle, Fred Freedman, got his master's degree in music here in the late 1950s. My sister, Carol, got her bachelor's degree here in either 1979 or 1980. And so this is a place that in the Freedman family has been very hallowed ground for a long time. And when they told me I was going to be staying at Iowa House on this visit, it got the sense memory going, because when I was going to school at UW-Madison, and my sister, who's just a year younger in school, was here at Iowa, I made many a drive down Highway 151 to get from Madison to Iowa City, and always stayed at the Iowa House. So for many reasons, I'm delighted to be back here. So just to frame the discussion, You know, when we think about the civil rights narrative and the series of events that in many ways hit their crescendo with the trinity of civil rights laws that Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, and the mass movement led by Dr. King combined to see made into law in the mid-60s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1966, we tend to situate the start of that story in the 1950s with Thurgood Marshall winning the Brown versus Board of Education decision, declaring school segregation unconstitutional. That's in 1954 with Dr. King and Rosa Parks launching the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And then we run the sequence of epic events forward from there. And there's nothing factually incorrect about any of that material, I guess, unless you're Ron DeSantis' version of Black history. But it is incomplete. And similarly, when a lot of people who think about Hubert Humphrey think about him, they think about only the last maybe decade or dozen years of his life, which were very, very difficult years. It's when he, along with Lyndon Johnson, supported the Vietnam War, even though, as we know privately, both of them had deep misgivings about it. And Humphrey's support for the war felt like an act of treason to his longtime liberal supporters. It was when he got the nomination for president without winning a single primary in 1968, basically handed to him by the party machine against the backdrop of the Chicago police beating up journalists and anti-war protesters. And then after narrowly losing to Richard Nixon that year, running as the establishment candidate against the peace candidate, his former protege too, George McGovern in 1972. And all this culminating tragically in his death at the very, very untimely age of 1966 in early 1978. And again, there's nothing factually incorrect here, but it's drastically incomplete. Because if you think about the pattern of events, the flow of history that brings us to the great achievements of the civil rights movement in the 60s, I would say you have to start not in the 50s, but a decade earlier, in the 1940s. The civil rights movement, as it evolves, is inextricably bound up with the global war against fascism, against the ideas of racial supremacy and religious exterminationism that were true of Nazi Germany, fascist Japan, and also in a different way, by the way, of Imperial Japan. The Japanese thought of themselves as racially superior to Koreans, and Chinese tried to eradicate both of those civilizations. And you have to think of a movement in which the leaders at that time, who deserved to be in the pantheon along with Dr. King and Malcolm X and Paul Robeson and others, but are much less known. A. Philip Randolph here on the bottom right, the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the most important black labor union, and the man who faced down FDR with a threatened march on Washington in 1941, unless FDR would integrate defense plans. And Walter White here, the executive secretary of the NAACP. Now, you may look at that photo of Walter White and think you're looking at a Caucasian, but in, as they call it, the one-drop rule of race in this country, the tiny bit of African blood that Walter White had was enough for him to be categorized in this binary society as black. And Walter White flipped the script on that. He would go to the Deep South and pass as a white person, take that incredible risk to gather intelligence and information on lynchings and other forms of white supremacist terrorism in the South. Remarkable, and these were two of the leaders of the 1940s, and the moral force from the 40s of the movement, and what propels it forward and ties in so much with what Hubert Humphrey and his partners, his allies, people like A. Philip Randolph and Walter White do, is the sacrifice of black GIs. Remember, the U.S. Army is segregated at this time. The whole society of the South is Jim Crow. In the North, it's very much up South. And black GIs agreed to go to war, to put their lives on the line for a country that treated them at best as second-class citizens, at worst as not even full human beings. And they did it for a cause they called Double V. You can see the logo there in that photo. Double V meant victory over fascism abroad, followed by victory over Jim Crow at home. They were going to leverage their sacrifice and their service for this imperfect country to demand that it live up to its greatest moral promises. And that's what pushes everything forward. You can't understand the 40s and beyond in civil rights without understanding black GIs, Double V, and the backdrop of a war against fascism. And similarly, for Hubert Humphrey, and this is going to bring me to where I will begin to debrief Norman for all of our benefit, the Humphrey of the 1940s in Minneapolis, when he's coming into active public life, first working on war mobilization and home front morale and educating soldiers who are about to go into combat, and then becoming a political figure who runs for mayor, narrowly loses in 1943, and then wins in 1945, running on a platform of civil rights and human rights in a city, and we'll talk about this later, that was one of the most notorious in the country for its racism and anti-Semitism. Forget everything you think you know about Minneapolis as this blue city. When you hear about Minneapolis in the 40s, you'll understand the path to George Floyd's murder. And that Humphrey is the Humphrey who anticipates the Humphrey some of us know from his work as vice president and in the Senate. And he was out there on civil rights when very few Caucasians were ready to put their, actually I'll get to this later, their physical safety, literally, on the line. Humphrey, Eleanor Roosevelt, Walter Reuther, Henry Wallace. It's a really short list of who was a meaningful partner with the African Americans who led this movement. But Humphrey was right there. And even at a time when Lyndon Johnson, as a delegate to the 1948 convention, was voting along with the rest of the Texas delegation against the civil rights plank that Humphrey managed to push through to sell to the whole convention, Humphrey was there on those issues early on. And so this really brings us actually right to the extraordinary Norman Sherman and his life. Norman grew up in the North Side Jewish ghetto of Minneapolis, which was cheek by jowl with the North Side black ghetto of Minneapolis. And about the time my book really hits its narrative crescendo in 1948, Norman was growing into what was going to be the beginning of his extraordinary political career in partnership with Hubert Humphrey, among others. And I just want to add two more footnotes. It really sells him short to say that he edited Humphrey's autobiography. Norman really did all the research and frankly wrote it. And no less a person than John Meacham says that Education of the Public Man is one of the greatest political autobiographies in American history.
I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, Google it. Google it. Norman's very online. You Google it tomorrow. He wrote it for the New York Times Book Review. And the other thing to know about Norman, besides his wonderfully fierce op-eds for the Gazette, we should all be so fierce at 97, that's all I can say, mazel tov on that, is that some Minneapolitans and Minnesotans, maybe some of you will recall the poignant eulogy that Walter Mondale gave for Hubert Humphrey, in which he has a phrase about how Hubert Humphrey taught us both how to die and how to live. I want you to know, with all due respect to Walter Mondale, this is who wrote the eulogy. So let's give Norman his props. But Norman, what I want to ask, because I never got to meet Hubert Humphrey. Everything I know about him, almost everything comes from the archival record. There were a few people I got to interview, you, DJ Leary, Hy Berman, a few others who were Walter Mondale involved with his life during the period of time when my book is focused. But you had the advantage of decades with him. And I wonder what your insights are to what I think was the driving question for me in this book, which is, why does this very vanilla guy from this very vanilla place, and I'll show you that place in a little bit, care so much about fighting for the equality of Black Americans and also Jewish Americans, Catholics, Nisei Japanese, the other minority groups who were prominent in this country at that time? What do you think made him tick in that way?
First, you should know that I was asked to be here because they said if Sam has to go to the bathroom, someone has to entertain the crowd. That's why I'm here. Humphrey didn't want to hire, well, I will tell you about my employment interview with Humphrey. He did not want to hire me. I had gone to Washington with a congressman whose campaign I'd run, but he had a wife who thought she had run it, and so I decided I would leave. I called the Humphrey office. Bill Connell, his AA, said I really needed another job. And he called back he said, come to Washington with Fraser. It's easier to get a job if you have one. And so I came, and I'd been in Washington just several weeks, and he called and said, I have a perfect job for you. It is to be our Minnesota political person. I didn't have to know anything about foreign affairs or civil rights even. I had worked with the civil rights group in Minneapolis when the single black professor at the University of Minnesota was fired on the basis that he was a communist, which he wasn't. He was the single. And I got involved and ran the student protest on that. And I will tell you another secret about me. I'm dumb. I was going to address the Board of Regents on Forrest Wiggins' firing, and I didn't own a shirt that was presentable. So I went to a department store in Minneapolis and bought a shirt, got it home, and it came down over my fingers. And I took it back and raised hell. They said it's French cuffs. And they sold me, I didn't have any money, they sold me a pair of cufflinks. And but I made friends with Cecil Newman, with other people. So that's, Humphrey had some idea who I was, and I'd worked briefly in the '60 campaign. I really am just babbling. When it came time, Bill Connell called and said, you have a job as our Minnesota political operative and Minnesota business guy, but Humphrey feels that he has to interview jobs at this level. So I've made an appointment for you at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I went at the appointed time, a tiny little whip office, one entrance to his place at 10 o'clock. And at 45 minutes later, I went to the secretary and said, I don't wait 45 minutes for anybody. Tell Senator Humphrey I'm no longer interested in the job. And I got back to my office. Bill called and said, oh, he was busy. And I said, bull. But he said, I've made an appointment tomorrow. Go at 10 tomorrow. I did. They ushered me in, and Humphrey was standing behind the desk, didn't look up, and was dusting. I discovered from South Dakota dust storms, when Humphrey got nervous, he dusted. But at that point, I just thought it was rude. And he didn't look up. He said, hi, Norman. And then he did look up, and he said to me, and I apologize for the crudity, it's his. He said, I've got work coming out of my ass. Do you know it? I said, yes, sir. He said, you're hired. That literally is the entire thing. I backed away from the desk toward the door, and he looked up and he said, do you type? Well, I said, yes. Well, he said, every time I hire a guy, he thinks he needs a secretary. You've got to do your own typing. And that established me. I wrote more letters to more constituents than anybody else in the office. I just spun them out, and I discovered then that when Humphrey first came to Washington, he told his staff, I want every letter answered the same day it comes in. It very quickly couldn't be done, but people would take folders of unanswered mail home one night and bring it back in the morning because Humphrey prowled the desks, and he was hooked on people. And it's different from the civil rights connection, but it's the human connection that Humphrey had with people. He just, he wanted them to know that he cared. And we used that slogan, "He cares," in the '68 campaign. He really did. I have lots of stories.
Okay.
You have some
Let me
questions?
let me add a couple of footnotes to some really important things that Norman said. When he mentioned the firing of the one black professor at the University of Minnesota, that's very emblematic of the degree of bigotry that was in Minneapolis, really till Humphrey and the political allies he built up in Minneapolis were able to crack that hold of intolerance on Minneapolis in the 40s. In Minneapolis, not only did you have restrictive covenants against blacks living in most neighborhoods of the city, also covenants against Jews there, you also had employment limited for blacks, for men only in service positions, busboys, chauffeurs, that sort of job. For the women, only domestic labor, and then, a veneer of black professionals, doctors, dentists, ministers, social workers, the great newspaper publisher Cecil Newman, who was probably the most important person in Humphrey's life on civil rights. But even at the University of Minnesota, which was this kind of whopping contradiction, Minnesota would, the U, as everyone calls it there, the U would bring in people like Zora Neale Hurston to speak at convocations, and at the same time, they wouldn't allow black students to live in the dorms. And there were Republican, and the dean of students would keep a census of black and Jewish students to make sure they didn't exceed a certain number, and would often report on them to a right-wing political operative in case any of them needed to be smeared later on. And the smear was usually to claim, as in this case, that they were communists. The other thing, before I go on, I want to underscore from what Norman said when he talked about Humphrey making sure that every piece of mail got answered. Oh, I saw that. It took me one entire summer, every day at the State Historical Society, to read all the correspondence from Humphrey's 3 years as mayor. But what was very moving in reading, I mean, some of it was, fun. An 8-year-old kid would write to ask for Humphrey to be his pen pal, and Humphrey would write back and say, "I'll be your pen pal." But also, as World War II ended and the remaining Jews who were alive were ending up in displaced persons camps, people would send letters that would be like, "Mayor, Minneapolis, United States." They had no idea who Humphrey was. These letters would be written along the lines of, "Dear Mr. Mayor, I'm so-and-so, and I'm in such and such a displaced persons camp. I am told that I have an uncle named blah, blah, blah in Minneapolis. Can you help me find him?" Because they wanted to be able to immigrate. And Humphrey would put handwritten notes on these letters to make sure that his staff worked on them. And he would sometimes find those people, find those relatives. He would also get a lot of letters I saw from black people in Minneapolis who could not get hired, who tell their stories about being denied jobs. And similarly, you'd see these priority notations that Humphrey would put on these letters to get his staff involved in trying to rectify those cases. But I want to come back to something about Humphrey's background, and it comes out of Norman's book. Humphrey is the least likely person, demographically and geographically, to take on the causes he took on, because this is where he grows up. When I talk about a vanilla guy from a vanilla place, I'm not just quoting George Clinton from P-Funk, this is what I mean. Dolan, South Dakota, population 500, is where he came from, about 250 miles west of the Twin Cities out in the wheat fields. There wasn't a black person within 40 miles until a town called Huron, where some black people worked as mechanics at a railroad switching yard. What they considered a minority group there, because everyone in Dolan was Anglo-Saxon or German or Scandinavian Protestant, what they considered a minority group out there were the Catholics in this town 10 miles away. And periodically, the Ku Klux Klan would burn a cross outside that town just to let the Catholics know they weren't welcome. And by the way, the same thing happened when Hubert Humphrey's father was a delegate in the 1928 Democratic Convention for Al Smith, the first Catholic to run as a major party candidate for president. When H.H., Humphrey's father, got back to Doland, he was greeted with a burning cross. So this is not a place where you expect such a crusader for equal rights to come up. And this is where I found in Norman's collected papers at the Historical Society, the outtakes from the interviews he did for Education of a Public Man, the parts that couldn't be squeezed into the book, but some of them ended up in the appendix and some of them were just archived. And in it, Humphrey tells this amazing story, which I think tells you something so important about his temperament. So he's 11 years old, and Doland is finally going to get connected to the outside world by a gravel road. Until this point, the railroad, the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, was the only way in or out of Doland. And that meant they had monopoly power over the prices that they would give farmers for their grain and ranchers for their livestock. And now, finally, this road's going to be built. And incredibly, the company, the subcontractor who's hired to literally lay the gravel is a black-owned company from Omaha, Nebraska. The Shipman Brothers. You can see the Shipman Brothers up there, upper right. And of course, or maybe not of course, but I thought this has got to have been written about in the local paper. And I did find it eventually. And the story that Humphrey tells in the book, or in the outtake from the book, is how he went out to introduce himself to the Shipman Brothers. Because his rather iconoclastic father had said to him, if you treat people like dogs, expect to be bitten. Even in this very parochial, insular place, H.H. was teaching Hubert to cross lines of race, to cross lines of religion, to cross lines of economic class. So 11-year-old Hubert goes out to befriend the Shipman Brothers, and they befriend him. And it's such an important event in his life that, again, decades later, when Norman's interviewing him for the book, he's recounting this. Now, look, I'm not going to say that if you have that kind of relationship as a child with a black adult, it's going to make you, committed to civil rights as an adult. I wish it were that way, but those of us who've read William Faulkner know that the story of the American South, as well as parts of the North, is of little white kids raised to adore the black women who raised them and then trained to reject them and hate them once those kids reached a certain age. So it's not that simple, not by a long shot. But I think this is something key about Humphrey's temperament. It is something that's laying latent in his personality until a few events later in his life that we'll talk about, that that's part of his essential makeup. And Norman, it makes me want to jump ahead and talk about one of the episodes that you know from Humphrey's Senate career. Now, we're just kind of skipping around here, but after 1948, the civil rights plank is put in a Democratic platform. Harry Truman wins election as a civil rights candidate because of a surge of black voters. Humphrey wins his Senate seat. That fall, takes office in early 1949. The Southern senators who controlled a lot of the power in the Senate did not forget what Humphrey had done. What can you say about the way Humphrey was treated? And then I'll have a follow-up for you.
Well, I get angry just thinking about it. Humphrey liked being liked. He really wanted approval from the world, from everyone. And the Southerners, they were the miserable sons of bitches. I really just, Strom Thurmond, not smart, hateful, just filled with vile. Humphrey comes here from Minnesota, excited. He's been to the convention. He's been a hero. He gets here and they say, I'm sorry, Senator, there's no office available for you. Absurd. They say you'll have to find your own space. They don't find alternative space. You've got the whole government. He could sit at the Library of Congress, nothing. And for weeks, his opening weeks as senator is filled with wanting to do right. They say no office, so he lives in a lawyer's office downtown and commutes to the floor when there's some reason. No one ever else has been denied an office like that, but he kept his mouth shut. He didn't raise hell. He waited and finally got into his office.
Just to underscore this, just to footnote it, so the Southern senators had so much power over committees, including office assignments. So basically, one of their punishments for Humphrey for daring to succeed at civil rights at the 48 convention is to deny him office space.
Well, and it cuts his chance to be productive, to meet other people. He's back and forth. I don't know how he did it, whether he took a cab, he didn't walk. In any case, that's one thing. Humphrey then hired, there were no black members of a Senate staff, none, zero. He hired a student. Sam and I have different messages. I think he was at George Washington. He thinks he was at American, and that's the worst conflict we have. Cyril later became governor of the Virgin Islands, but he was the only black staffer in the entire Senate, first one. Humphrey took him to lunch, and the senator's dining room is a big, elegant office. No one eats there except the senator and his guests. Humphrey arrives with his guest, and the maitre d', who is black himself, says, "I'm sorry, Senator, we don't serve Negroes." Humphrey said, "What?" I wasn't there, but he said something like that. Finally, the maitre d' went off to talk to Jim Eastland, another genius from the South. He was in charge of facilities. The Southerners controlled everything. I mean, if there were a fire, they wouldn't turn on the water till they had an approval from a Southern senator.
Wow.
Any case, I just made that up.
Oh.
He believes anything. I really like a journalist like that.
Hey, I do a little bit of verification. Come on.
The maitre d' disappears, comes back. But before he comes back, Humphrey says, "We're going to sit down there. I'm a senator." And he barged in, and Cyril was the first black employee who could have lunch with other senators. How Humphrey was able to insist without offending the Southerners is a talent I don't understand, but he had it.
Well, he had that very, Humphrey worked civil rights really at a very personal end and then clearly at an overarching legislative end. But the personal end is both true to his personality, but there's an interesting family backstory to it also. So Hubert Humphrey, this amazing younger sister named Frances, who's really in some ways is his older sister in terms of influence. While Humphrey had to drop out of college during the Depression to help his family move to a different city, start up a different drugstore. They had lost their home and their drugstore in Doland and had to move. His sister Frances realized there's no way she was going to be able to stay in college as a daughter in the family, considering the gender norms of that time. So she got herself to Washington, D.C., and lived with an uncle who worked for the agriculture department and put herself through GWU and ended up with a social work degree, and while she was doing social work for the Council of Churches in Washington, got discovered by Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was working with ER on, I think, one of the war preparation programs. They were in one of the New Deal agencies, and they wanted to have lunch for their staff, and their staff was integrated. And ER and Frances go over to the Shoreham Hotel, which, like every other, except for the all-black hotels in D.C., was segregated, and say, you know, we're bringing our staff in for lunch, knowing that it's breaking the color line, but they gamble on the fact that a maitre d' isn't going to refuse a lunch party led by the First Lady. And that's how they desegregate. And I really have to wonder if Hubert hadn't heard that story from Francis, because there are a couple of examples similar to what he does in the Senate dining room. He also does it in a particular restaurant in Minneapolis when he's mayor, a restaurant called Charlie's, when he brings in someone from the National Urban League with him, a black man named William Sebron, and basically sort of dares the restaurant to turn the mayor and the mayor's guest away. So that was that very personal side, and of course it ties in with the legislative side as well. But I want to also talk, there's Francis Humphrey, by the way. I want to talk about what I think is the year that makes Humphrey this person on civil rights, notwithstanding that almost mythological revelatory moment when he's 11, when he meets the Shipman Brothers graveling crew. He is coming into his adulthood pretty much as a standard issue New Deal liberal, which is to say, and I don't mean at all any disparaging here, he's seeing politics purely through economic class. He's seeing the creation of and protection of economic equality as the core issue for liberal politics. And that's really important. But he also, like many New Deal liberals of that time who viewed politics purely through class, didn't see it as urgent to confront forms of discrimination frontally. That if all boats got lifted by giving people WPA jobs and CCC positions for their kids and so forth, that's great, no opposition to it, but that was different from directly taking on forms of intolerance. What changes him and really sends him on the path that'll have as mayor and senator as vice president is 1 year in his life when he goes to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to go to grad school. So because he'd had to drop out for 5 years from the University of Minnesota to help his family survive economically during the worst of the Depression, he doesn't get back to school to finish up his bachelor's degree till he's 28 years old in 1939. And by that time he's married, and he and his wife Muriel have the first of their 4 kids. And he's only going to be able to go to grad school if he gets a decent graduate assistantship somewhere. And lo and behold, his mentor at the University of Minnesota has a friend who's a professor in what's called the government department at LSU, who writes a letter to that prophet in Minnesota saying almost verbatim, hey, you know, Evron, if you have any Yankees who would be willing to come down to Dixie for $400, I've got a graduate assistantship. And Humphrey takes that graduate assistantship, and $400 then is $8,500 now. So it was a pretty substantial amount of money. And it's when Humphrey goes to Baton Rouge that he lives in a Jim Crow society for the first time. I mean, he'd barely been geographically in the South in his life up to that point. 99% of his life until then had been in either South Dakota or Minnesota. And even though Minneapolis had a tawdry, horrible record of racism, Humphrey had been kind of oblivious to it as a college student, and of course had been gone for 5 important years in the middle of the 1930s as well. But then he gets to Baton Rouge, and he's plunged into a Jim Crow society. And where he and Muriel are living near downtown is 1.5 miles away from the LSU campus, and in between is the main black neighborhood of Baton Rouge, which is called either South Baton Rouge, or to disparage it by outsiders, called the Bottoms. And Humphrey goes back and forth through that neighborhood sometimes multiple times a day. And again, I'm so indebted to Norman's book for this. Humphrey remarks on, of course, the standard images, the searing images a lot of us have of Jim Crow, of American apartheid, the separate drinking fountains, the separate waiting rooms, the back of the bus. He talks about all that, but very Humphrey-like, it's more individual, granular episodes of degradation that stay with him. He talks about seeing a black pedestrian, reviled with the N-word because a white motorist doesn't think he's crossing the street fast enough. He talks about going down to the state capitol building in Baton Rouge and seeing black citizens standing and waiting minute after minute after minute for an elevator that's empty because they're fearful of what it would mean to get into an elevator with white people, what might befall them. And he even talks, and this goes to the point I was making earlier about Faulkner, about one of his white classmates in grad school who talks about how I hated my mother, I loved the black woman who raised me, but I understood the time would come when I had to hate her. And, I sometimes wonder about the cost people pay for that. I tried to track down that guy, and he died of cirrhosis of the liver in his 40s. And I sometimes wonder if the hate he directed out at the black woman he loved became the hate that led him to drink himself to death. That's just speculation, but you can't help but wonder. These are the things that Humphrey takes away from Baton Rouge. And the incredible thing is a lot of people, Northern liberals, having a year in Baton Rouge, it was just a one-year master's program, and heading back north would be like, oh boy, what a relief. I'm out of the benighted primitive South. I'm back to the educated, enlightened North. Humphrey has totally the opposite reaction. When Humphrey goes back to Minneapolis, he sees the city in all of its moral corruption clearly for the first time. And I'm going to turn this over to Norman for some of his memories in a moment, but just to give you a sense of what had been going on in Minneapolis during those years. So that photo in the top left, maybe some of you know about the infamous case of Ossie and Sweet from Detroit. Does anyone know about that case? Okay, then I'll skip over that footnote. But that's a night in July 1931. Everybody's there in their best clothes, if you look closely. Fedoras, coat and tie, dresses. Their celebratory event is that they're besieging the house that has just been bought by a black World War II veteran who works for the post office. And it's so intolerable to the good people of Minneapolis that a black family should move in, that night after night they are surrounding this house. And it takes them a couple of years, but eventually they make life so miserable for the Arthur Lee family that the Lees pull out. That was race in Minneapolis. And I want to tell you, it's not just the people who you might think of as the great unwashed and right-wing extremists and so forth who did that. I read a master's thesis done by a white sociology student at the University of Minnesota who interviewed people about that episode and other cases of race relations. And one of the people she interviewed was a future governor of Minnesota named Hjalmar Peterson from the Democrat Farmer Labor Party, the Liberal Party, who says to her, I believe, in liberalism. I've given my whole political life to liberalism. And, I don't know what these blacks have to complain about. We let them live in their own neighborhood. I don't know why they want to move out. And I have to tell you, and remember, this is a liberal political figure saying this, if they moved into my neighborhood and wouldn't listen to reason, then for the sake of my family and my race, I would consider it reasonable to kill the thing, not even the person, the thing. So that was the state of race relations in Minneapolis. And then just quickly to turn to the anti-Semitic part of things, that upper right-hand photo, you might think you're looking at a bowling team because they have the logo gear on, but it's actually a group called the Silver Legion, better known as the Silver Shirts. They were a explicitly pro-Nazi group, national group, but very welcomed in Minneapolis. One of their patrons was a senator from the state, Senator Ernest Lundeen. They were explicitly modeled on Hitler's brown shirts. That's why they were called the Silver Shirts. And that was a group that was widely accepted. So this was the kind of stuff that Humphrey discovered when he returned to Minneapolis and that he resolved to take on. I'll say more about that later. But Norman, you were growing up on the North Side during these years in this Jewish microclimate next to this black microclimate. How much were you aware, or how much did you come to realize subsequently about the rigidity of racism and anti-Semitism in Minneapolis?
Well, I knew that I would never be the president of General Mills. But, well, there are several stories I'll tell you of this. When I was in grade school, it was Jewish and black, mostly. I went home one day, I don't know how, second, third, fourth grade, said to my immigrant mother, who barely spoke good English, they checked us for head lice today. They lined us up in the gym. They treated black kids really mean and didn't do anything. And she gave me a lecture about democracy. Mm-hmm. And she used the Yiddish word for black, schwarze, but said that I had to respect everybody. It started in the grade school. I remember the nurse as being a giant. She may have been 4 feet tall, but I heard sheeny, kike, the nasty words they had for Jews, but I never took it, I guess you're just used to it. You function, you don't challenge anybody. So there were some. My older sibs had more problems with it.
What was your awareness of race in Minneapolis as you were growing up there?
Almost none. For one thing, we lived, the poor unemployed Jews lived next, and it was just part of it. I don't remember ever thinking much about it except for that one instance. So I want to interrupt your flow and do two things. I want you to know a couple of things about Humphrey. When he was dying, he asked for a Watts line. Remember the old days, the wide area telephone service. He got one so he could call people and thank them before he died. The phone rang one night, and he said, "This is Hubert." I never called him Hubert, but he was permitted. And just thanked me for the things. I thought when I hung up, I said to Jenny, he's called to say goodbye, and he was. That was one thing. The other thing he did, he called Richard Nixon, whom he detested, who cheated and stole the election that kept Humphrey out of the history books as president. He called him and said, "There's going to be a memorial service for me in the rotunda. I would like you to come." Nixon said, "I haven't been back to Washington since I left. I can't." Humphrey spent enough time working him over to get him to come. When I saw Jimmy Carter, all the ex-presidents, and Mondale, I can take credit for Mondale's eulogy because as a ghostwriter, you don't appear. But a reporter came up to Fritz after the event and said that was really very good. And Mondale said instantaneously, "Norman Sherman wrote it." Nobody gives credit to ghostwriters. That's why you're a ghost. Fritz did, and I read it once in a while and get choked up. I was going to tell you one other thing about Humphrey. When he was the whip, in the Senate, before being vice president, he had a driver. And one day, the driver was not Tom, was someone else. And he said, where? He said, Tom's wife died, and the memorial service is this morning, and so I'm driving. Well, Humphrey said, I want to go to the service. Wasn't invited, wasn't expected. He ended up going to the office, freshening up, getting back in the car and going to Anacostia, a black ghetto in Washington, D.C., and just walked in. No votes, no press, no nothing, but Tom and maybe 40 or 50 people. And I want to tell you another thing, just because I like telling it. When I was about to be married a second time, I had been asked by a black judge, Howard Bennett, said that his daughter was at Radcliffe and a friend wanted to work in Washington. Would I interview her? I had decided after my first marriage failed that my second wife would be young, beautiful, smart, and Jewish. And the woman came, and by God, she was young, she was smart, she was there at Radcliffe on a scholarship, she was gorgeous, and she was Jewish, and I didn't know where I would get her a job, but I decided to marry her. Her mother was very conservative and told Evelyn that she would not come to the wedding if Humphrey were there.
Wow.
And he came by my desk one day. He got his schedules on a Thursday afternoon and said, Norman, you know how busy I am. Your wedding is not on the schedule. And I said, Mr. Vice President, you're not invited. Which I thought took a little bit of guts or stupidity, but he waved and went on. The next Thursday, he stopped a second time and said again, your wedding is not on the schedule. And I smiled. Mr. Vice President, you're not invited. And he waved again. A third week, he came back thinking that something, I don't know what he thought. He came back and asked another time, and I said, look, goddammit, when I tell you you're not invited, you are not invited. No. He said, I explained, he said, I didn't mean to embarrass you. I said, you didn't embarrass me. But in any case, we were getting married on a Friday. A couple of weeks later, on Monday, the mother-in-law-to-be showed, and we argued. And on Wednesday, she called and said it would be okay if Humphrey came. Uh-huh. I've insulted him 3 times. He is the Vice President of the United States. But on Thursday, I decided, well, goddammit, I want him there if I can have him. So I went and said a funny thing has happened. I explained the change, and without a moment, he said, tell Ursula to cancel my schedule, I'll be there. That's the kind of forgiving guy I was. My daughter says, I can't tell you this, but
Which is a guarantee you will.
he arrived, and there were only a dozen of us. He had great peripheral vision. He embraced Evelyn, spotted the mother-in-law, and moved in on her. And what Lucy said I shouldn't say is I could hear the elastic in her pants snap. After that, if we got within 200 miles of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, she showed up and said, I'm Norman Sherman's mother-in-law. Anyway, back to you.
Well, I'll add a few footnotes, not to the story of Norman's second wedding, but a couple of the other things. When you talk about the memorial service in the rotunda, this again happened at a time when Humphrey's reputation was at a fairly low ebb. I mean, he was very cherished by many of the people who served within the Senate, but a lot of popular opinion had turned against him. But at least as I heard the story, and maybe you can tell me whether this is true or what we call in Yiddish a baba maisa, a grandmother tale, but is that spontaneously the black residents of Anacostia lined the streets when the hearse with Humphrey's coffin passed through Anacostia, because they remembered 1948 and 1964, what Humphrey had put on the line. And when you talk about him being the whip in the Senate, and the whip, in case you don't know, is the person in the party leadership who basically has to count heads and count votes and make sure people keep their word when you're trying to get enough votes. And with the Civil Rights Act of 64, there wasn't going to be a problem getting 51 votes to pass the bill. The big problem was that the Southerners and sometimes conservative Republicans from outside the South would combine on filibusters, mostly the Southerners who would talk. Strom Thurmond once talked for 24 hours. And you needed what was called a cloture vote, which meant 2/3. So 67 senators out of the 100 had to vote to cut off the filibuster. And that was always the benchmark that civil rights supporters could not reach to get the bill taken up. Unless you could cut off the filibuster, the bill would never come to a vote. And so LBJ went to Humphrey, and Humphrey could really see the big picture. Humphrey was so integral to this bill. Humphrey and his staff were part of writing the bill. Humphrey, as I said before, was onto civil rights a dozen years before, at least 15 years, 20 years almost before LBJ, to his credit, got involved. Humphrey had been chosen, would be chosen by vice president because of the credibility he gave Johnson on civil rights. But Johnson, understanding everyone's vulnerability, realized he needed some Republican votes. And Everett Dirksen, who was this vainglorious windbag from Illinois, was the leader of the Republican minority in the Senate. And Johnson really needed Dirksen to deliver a few votes, mostly from some Republican senators in the upper Midwest and in the Farm Belt. And Johnson knew that you had to make Dirksen feel overly important. He had to feel like it was his bill, his triumph, his moment in history. And so he says to Humphrey, and again, add on or correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I do have this, I think, on the authority of Robert Caro, which is pretty good, that your job is to butter up Everett Dirksen, make him feel like everything is his doing, let him take all the limelight, even when he doesn't deserve it. And Humphrey, understanding the bigger picture, did exactly that and subordinated his own really integral role in the long civil rights struggle to bring on a latecomer like Everett Dirksen, who could deliver a few necessary votes. And this meant so much to Humphrey that in his papers at the History Center in St. Paul is this narrow sheet of newsprint on which was pre-printed the names of every senator and a little box next to each one, yes or no, Y or N. And this was Humphrey's list for how people were voting on cloture. And it was so important to him that they got, I think in the end, 73 votes to break the filibuster, that he kept that in his papers for the rest of his life and, of course, in perpetuity. So that's what it had meant to him to get that through. And I just want to now come back to a couple of other people who were part of Humphrey's evolution on civil rights, because when he gets to Minneapolis from Baton Rouge, and he sees the degree of bigotry in Minneapolis, he still needs to get to know more about the city and to figure out how to take it on. And the most important person, I'm convinced, in Humphrey's life in terms of civil rights is this man, is Cecil Newman. Cecil Newman was a Pullman porter. He was a member of A. Philip Randolph's labor union. Actually, he and Randolph grew to be very close. And he took the money he made as a porter, and while he was a porter, he was working part-time as a journalist as well, into founding a series of black newspapers and magazines, the most long-lasting of which, the Minneapolis Spokesman, is still published to this day by his granddaughter, Tracy Williams Dillard. And Cecil Newman had been involved in this lonely, futile fight against racism in Minneapolis for 17 years by the time Humphrey gets to town in 1940. And he'd done extraordinary things. He called out police brutality. He wrote about labor unions that wouldn't have black members. He wrote about breweries that wouldn't hire black workers and tried to organize a boycott of those breweries. He shamed or tried to shame the white newspapers that would use all this dog whistle terminology when they wrote about black life in Minneapolis, which for them meant only black crime. And Cecil Newman was fierce and uncompromising and courageous, but the black community was small, and he really was unable to make significant headway because he just couldn't amass the voting power to force change. And he had never had anyone from the white community who had both a conscience and power. There were people who had a conscience, but they were also the outcasts in their own community. They were powerless. And then here comes Hubert Humphrey in 1940, searching out Cecil Newman, getting to know Cecil Newman, learning from Cecil Newman. And Humphrey has political ambition and political skill. And they remained incredibly tight for the rest of their lives. They died 1 or 2 years apart. And I'm going to jump ahead here, but at the point later on when Humphrey, at the 1948 convention, wins the battle over a civil rights plank. These are some scenes from 1948. And gets the Democratic Party to finally break Franklin Roosevelt's cynical bargain with the South, which is you can have Jim Crow if you'll give me your votes on Election Day in Congress. And finally, Humphrey and A. Philip Randolph, who's protesting outside, and their allies are able to get the votes to have a real meaningful civil rights plank. I read all the letters and telegrams and postcards Humphrey got in response. And by the way, they're pretty equally divided between praise and hate. There was a lot of hate, and I want to tell you, plenty of it came from the North. But the second telegram Humphrey got was from Muriel, his wife, and one of his really closest political advisors. The first one was from Cecil Newman. And Humphrey, it took him a few weeks to get around to responding to everyone, especially those he was closest to. And he wrote back to Cecil Newman, and he says, "This wasn't my triumph, this was our triumph." There are some key things Humphrey says at that moment. That's one of them. He also has some really important correspondence with people from A. Philip Randolph's labor union, because A. Philip Randolph, another utterly fearless public figure, Randolph in 1948 is saying that black young men should refuse to register for the draft and refuse to serve if they're called up unless Harry Truman desegregates the military. And people in Congress, liberals like Wayne Morse, are threatening to bring him up on charges of treason. A. Philip Randolph's like, bring it on, you know? And he is leading protests outside the convention hall every day. I'll show you. You can see him right there. He's carrying a sign, "Prison is better than Army Jim Crow service." That's A. Philip Randolph. And Humphrey, after the victory with the civil rights plank, is writing back and forth with people from Randolph's union. And what they're each saying, and this really is key to 1964, is that they needed each other. That the mass movement that Randolph led knew they needed people on the inside who knew how to pull the levers of politics. And the people on the inside, like Humphrey, knew that you needed pressure from the outside, that if you didn't have a mass movement exerting pressure, that a lot of people would be complacent or timid in the end. They recognized the necessary interdependence of the inside game and the outside game. And Norman, you know, that reminds me so much of what happens in the mid-60s with, you know, Dr. King and others on the outside, and of course Johnson and Humphrey and others, Paul Douglas, on the inside. You were around, you were proximate for some of that. What were your observations about that synergy between inside and outside?
Synergy, what the hell is?
I know, it is a cliche. I'm sorry. Please don't tell any of my Columbia students I used it.
Are we running?
If they wrote it in their paper, I would circle it and say cliche.
I have two Martin Luther King stories that I'll tell them in reverse order. The day that Martin Luther King was assassinated was a big fundraiser in Washington for the Democratic National Committee. Humphrey was the main speaker as vice president. It's the glittery big donor. You can't get fancier. And I sat at a table at the rear of the hall, packed with big money people. Secret Service came to me and said, Martin Luther King has been shot, but would you go up and tell Humphrey? Because if we go up, it'll call attention to it. So I went up and told him, and he said, keep me informed, and went back to sitting at the head table. I got back, and very shortly thereafter, the agent came up and said he's died. I went up, beckoned to Humphrey to come over. He leaned over the table, and I said that Dr. King had died. And the chairman of the dinner was from Alabama, very rich. Humphrey got up, told him that what had happened, said, I'm going to adjourn the evening. And the guy spoke Alabama. He said, you can't do that. These are rich people. And Humphrey got ready to push him aside. They were just short of a physical altercation. And Humphrey took the microphone and announced the death and adjourned the meeting. The Alabama big bucks, I'm sure if he lived this long, would be angry still. The other thing, I don't know, are we running out of time?
Well, we'll take some questions after this.
Well, I want to tell you one other story. At one point, during the civil rights thing, Humphrey had never met one-on-one with Martin Luther King. He asked John Stewart, who was our legislative guy. By the way, John was the civil rights guy on our staff, and Humphrey in his autobiography said the bill would not have passed without this staff man doing things and leading me. It's an eloquent thank you to staff, which political leaders don't often do. In any case, he got King, brought in two guys, Andrew Young, who later became, they're two ministers, later became our ambassador to the United Nations, Walter Fauntroy, who was the equivalent of mayor of Washington, D.C., and in the House, and John and me. So there were six of us. And he wanted to tell King what his tactics are, what his goals were, what he would compromise on. It was really an explication of the future. But he had one request of King: see if you can keep the rhetoric down, the meanness. We had the black nationalists. People were pissed. They didn't like being discriminated against. But he pled with King because he said, I've got to deal with these guys. And I think King went away, and nobody ever said yes, no. He did try to keep the rhetoric down so we could get the borderline guys. I wanted to tell you one other thing. Cloture about Claire Engle. Claire Engle was a senator from California who was dying of a brain tumor. He couldn't talk. He couldn't walk. When the cloture vote came, he was wheeled in It was a surprise to me. Humphrey may have probably knew. He was wheeled in and down the aisle, you know, where the State of the Union aisle, wheeled in, and the Sergeant at Arms calls the roll, Mr. Engel of California. With great effort, he pointed at his eye.
Wow.
And the Sergeant at Arms said, Mr. Engel votes aye. And that may be the one moment in my life that I certainly will never forget.
Wow.
I forgot what else I was.
Well, I'd say that's an incredible image and note to end this part of our program on. Now we'd like to open it up for the next 15 minutes or so to your questions.
Oh, I have one other thing. Is Muriel Humphrey.
No.
Yeah. This poster is from 1968. We could afford, or were determined, to put a civil rights poster up that didn't need any explanation. And that is Mrs. Humphrey with these two kids. These posters went around the country. And I think of what we've come to now, and I don't understand the trip from then, filled with hope, willing to do things that you thought would attract votes because it was on civil rights. And today, okay.
We'll let the walkers find the people with questions. So you just choose whoever you'd like.
Okay.
Our job is to answer.
All right. My question has to do with the end of the 1968 campaign. Norman alluded to it. LBJ had announced that there was a breakthrough and there could be peace talks, except the South Vietnamese backed out. And the reason they backed out is because Nixon sent emissaries to them,
Right.
told them not to. And the reason we know that is because the South Vietnamese embassy was bugged. My question specifically about Hubert Humphrey is, was he aware of that going on at the time? Did he have input to that? And the reason LBJ didn't do anything is because he didn't want to reveal the bugging of the embassy.
We were informed, not by LBJ. LBJ in my book is scum. I detest him. He cuckolded Humphrey. Any case, in that specific, we were told by George Ball, who was the Undersecretary of State, that Anna Chennault, who was married to a general, an American general, Claire Chennault, was undermining, telling them not to sign, not to agree, because they get a better deal from Nixon. I pled with Humphrey. I thought we would win with it for sure. I pled with Humphrey to let me spill the beans, to describe to every press I could what was going on. I thought Nixon was guilty of treason, and Humphrey said, no, said if he wins, I don't want him burdened with a treason charge. He shouldn't win in spite of what you said. It was a bad judgment on his part. We would have won.
The other thing I'd heard, Norman, correct me if this is wrong, and I think this came from a Kurt Anderson podcast called Nixon at War, where I first learned about this, is that also Humphrey felt that the public wasn't ready to absorb that kind of a revelation just 2 or 3 days before the election,
Yes.
that they thought that it would be perceived as, ironically, it was Nixon's dirty trick, but that would be understood by much of the public as an attempt to do a dirty trick against him, and that they wanted to try to win by taking the high road.
Yeah, I told Humphrey, you can fire me if it backfires, and hire me after you win. He thought it was a toss-up. no.
There was a big difference between 1964 and 1968. LBJ obviously was riding high in 64. What was Humphrey's calculation about accepting the VP position? What did he see as being the strengths and weaknesses? Obviously, he couldn't, well, maybe he could, foresee what was going to happen with Vietnam and how that was going to wipe everything else out. But in the moment of 64, what was his calculation?
Well, I'll tell you a couple of things here. After he was elected in 65, at the first National Security Council meeting, which a vice president is on by law, Johnson called one in February, sworn in on January 20th, a couple of weeks later, and Humphrey had prepared a document saying we got to get out of Vietnam, that the liberals in the Democratic Party will turn on us, that the labor movement will turn on us. We must get out. He thought he had cleared it with McNamara and Dean Rusk, Secretary of State and Defense. Nobody spoke up on his side. Johnson got furious, said, "You're jeopardizing the lives of my two sons-in-law," and it went on and on and on, and he never had another National Security Council meeting. He called it the Tuesday Lunch Club, to which he did not have to invite Humphrey. So for a full year, Humphrey was excluded from any role as vice president. We did superficial things, and I think I advanced 2 trips to Vietnam, and on one of them, there was a Marine Corps general whom I knew, that Humphrey knew, who Humphrey said, "Get him in to plan my visit." I used to do all of his advances overseas. Anyway, in Saigon, General Beckington would suggest things that we do, and Westmoreland wouldn't see me. In every other country I went to, the ambassador would make a courtesy thing, and I would work with Westmoreland wouldn't see me, but whatever schedule I'd worked out with Herb and the other brass would go in, and it would come back out with the things that Herb had suggested off. And it was many years later, a reporter asked me if I understood why that happened. And I said, no. He said he was trying to show you that you were getting a crock on what was really happening in Vietnam. He couldn't, as a general, say anything without violating the chain of command, but that was what he was trying to do.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, I just going to say reading. Let me tell you one other thing. When in 1964, Joe Rao, Jim Loeb had told us that Humphrey was going to be picked, but if we leaked it, Johnson could still change his mind. So we were diddled around. We got a call from the White House saying, come to Washington, assuming that was going to be the blessing. When he got to the airport, there was a second senator going on the plane, Tom Dodd of Connecticut, who was a drunk, a mediocre senator, and it was show business, we thought, but Dodd thought it might be. They flew to Washington. They put Humphrey in a car, but it wasn't to go anywhere. Dodd was taken to the White House, so the press saw him go in. And Humphrey, literally, they said, just stay away. And he got in a car and they drove off, screwed around there, and nothing. I shouldn't talk about Johnson because there are a limited number of four-letter words I can use. He was awful to Humphrey. There was one visit, we went to the ranch. Johnson ordered a cowboy suit for Humphrey and purposely ordered one that was too large so that he looked scrawny, terrible. On a legitimate briefing, he permitted Richard Nixon to talk to the press, but he forbade Humphrey from doing it. So we had to get in and out without saying a word. Humphrey was wrong on Vietnam, but at the end of the first year of exclusion, Johnson cut salaries, number of people who could be on the staff. He decided, vice presidents used to go on that big airplane. It's the United States of America. We had a small jet. You couldn't carry many, one press, two press. It didn't have the aura of greatness, of celebrity, or whatever. But Johnson was that petty that, who the hell cares what the airplane is? So my point is, if he had bowed to get out through the door, that if he could have entered every city while he was vice president standing up straight, we might have won.
Right. I think we'll take one more question, but I'll just add a few more things to what Norman said. One of the things that's always confounded me about the way Johnson froze out Humphrey on Vietnam is that we know from some of the White House tapes that at the same time Johnson's talking to Senator Richard Russell and basically saying, this is going to end badly. I don't know how to get out, but I know, this is, he didn't use the word quagmire then, but that was the idea. So Johnson had some of the same doubts that he punished Humphrey for expressing. And the other thing about Humphrey being named vice president is that, and this is that kind of, venal side of Johnson, is that he wanted Humphrey for his civil rights cred, among other reasons, but he put him through an audition process that was brutal. The audition was, there was a segregated delegation from Mississippi that was going to be seated at the convention, and it had been challenged as a result of activity by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi by what was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an integrated delegation that had been selected with its own primary election in Mississippi, and they wanted to be seated instead of the Jim Crow delegation. Johnson didn't want a battle like the 1948 convention and didn't want it seen on TV. So he stipulated that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was going to get 2 seats, 2 symbolic seats. And he told Humphrey that he had to go and tell the Mississippi Freedom Party, that's all you're getting. And this was after many Americans had heard the excruciating testimony of Fannie Lou Hamer about having been beaten repeatedly, and they knew about the murders of civil rights workers and the burnings of churches. And Humphrey has to go and, not even persuade, but just announce this minimal representation to one of his best friends, who Norm mentioned before, Joe Rao, who was the attorney for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So Humphrey did this, and in the end, the Mississippi delegation walked out, the segregated one, so the Mississippi Freedom delegates did all sit. But at the time, and really for a lot of people in memory, it seemed like an incredibly ruthless act on Johnson's part, with which Humphrey uncharacteristically took part, because again, this was the audition for the role of vice president.
Let me tell one more story.
Okay, then we should get to our...
At the March on Washington, the Mississippi delegation, there were 250,000 people packed. The Mississippi delegation had all purchased bib overalls, new bib overalls as a costume. We were pickaninnies. They came through the crowd. I looked up at one point, and the crowd was just parting, so they could come through and be just at the foot of the memorial. And I don't know who the genius was thinking buy those overalls.
I can't remember if it was James Bevel, it was,
Yeah.
or who it was, but or maybe it was Bob Moses, but it was one of the SNCC people who thought this is going to show our, our commitment to the poorest of the poor, there's a great black phrase, dry long sow. It means sort of ordinary as dirt, to the dry long sow people. And the bib overalls became the symbol of that. Anyway, I'm sorry we've kept you waiting with your question.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm Tony Kern. Hi, and thank you for coming. I just have this really incredible thing just gnawing at my brain, which I've got the chance to speak to somebody 97 years of age directly. I mean, how you've seen things evolve where I can stand up and address you directly. What, in this particular day and age, today, as we stand less than 2 weeks away from an election, a pivotal election, I just need to know, from all of your lived knowledge, not the politicos, not the candidates, but what do you see that is the same about the electorate, about the people that are voting, and what they have to say and their dedication to the candidates? What is the political climate most like and most dislike from that time when we were talking about a quagmire overseas that was divisive, that we were talking about people's collective rights and collective freedoms as an American? Can you please tell me 3 things that are similar, maybe 3 things that are dissimilar?
Norman, that is such a great way to end, and I'm happy to let you, in your
I didn't hear, I don't hear very well.
Okay, so he was saying, what are 3 things that seem to most similar in the political climate this year as opposed to the political climate, say, in 64 and 68, and 3 things that are most different? Was that an okay gloss on it? Okay, thanks. And this means that you have to bear the burden of sagacity, because when you're an op-ed columnist at 97, you got to drop the wisdom, Norman.
I really am not competent to answer. I can't believe how bad it is right now. To think that the bigotry of the 68 and the Vietnam thing was better than it is today is really something. I don't know. I am confused. I'm hopeful. I think some of the swing states on the Senate give me courage, but I haven't, I never worked in politics. I don't know. I'll leave it to you.
Oh, no, I'm only going to say thank you to our many, many incredible community and university sponsors. This has been an extraordinary event. Thanks to all of you for turning out in spite of predictions of hail. And Norman, most of all, thanks to you for an extraordinary life of political work and journalism and, to use the word, Menschlichkeit, the quality of being a mensch. It's been an honor to know you and to share tonight with you.
Oh.
Thank you all.